Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Today's discussion is really a part two. Part one was something we covered some information at the Big Data Summit about 6 months ago. And so I want to do is a brief refresher on that because I think it sets the stage for a lot of the other things that we're going to talk about today. And at that summit we talked about the idea of this measuring life, of datafication of everything. And in this scenario, we talked about how there was some researchers who were able to, through the inputting 360 different sensors within the seat, were able to identify each unique different user. So apparently the way we sit, if we put enough sensors there, is uniquely identifiable. And so what that led to was this idea that a seat is no longer just a seat. It becomes something very, very different and enables all sorts of different uses. So what we're starting to see is taking all aspects of life and turning them into data. Talked about collecting big data. These ideas that we don't know the future value of the data. We've heard that earlier today. And we can't connect the dots we don't have. And the feeling is that the traditional requirements-driven collection fails. So we collect everything and we keep it all. At least those were kind of the key points noted by the CTO of the CIA in his presentation at GigaOM. I bring that up because I think that there's some truths here in terms of how we think about big data. But falling back to what Blaise was talking about earlier, there's some really, really interesting implications about what this means. Talked a little bit about the role of the algorithm and how that's growing. Interesting article about how we're training how drones are now enabled to, quote unquote, make decisions. Interesting quote there from Rear Admiral on their drone program. The other quote here is from Google in talking about how they were making decisions as to what articles would appear in Google News. Interesting point here, I think, is no humans were harmed or even used in the creation of this page. Again, I think that sets the stage for some very, very interesting questions. We also talked about what we must do. Great quote from I found this a really fascinating book I mentioned last time, is Technopoly. So once the technology is admitted, it plays out its hand. Does what it's designed to do. Our task is to understand what that design is. We need to, before we admit that technology, we should have our eyes wide open and asking all the right questions. So why do we need to keep our eyes open? Because I think we all know data is just starting to play out its hand. A couple of great examples. We're seeing it all over in terms of there is all sorts of opportunity identifying areas where if there's going to be an outage, we can identify it earlier through this massive collection of data and the creation of these new algorithms. On the other side, we can now, using different algorithms, identify what might be a top hit on Billboard. We might even be able to design a hit just simply based on the algorithms. The situation here was that they designed these algorithms and were able to apply it to, I think, Norah Jones' first album before she released it, and they identified it was going to be a big hit, and nobody else thought it was going to be a big hit. Well, something was right here. Of course, on each of these, there's a downside. I think any of you are familiar with the Terminator films, very familiar with Skynet. and the implications of where things could go. Another example. One day, somebody from the marketing department walks in, says, if we want to figure out if a customer's pregnant, even if she didn't want to know, could you help? Well, yeah, can. And I think most of you are familiar with the Target example. And it turns out that really new parents are fantastic. It's a great opportunity, a whole new buying opportunity, a whole new stage of consumerism. And there are points in people's lives when those routines change and when there's an opportunity. And data can enable us to make great things happen, or maybe turn out a little bit creepy. For those of you who know the story or don't know the story, the situation here was the Target was able to identify potentially people who may be pregnant. They then would send coupons, vouchers to those individuals, and in this case they sent it to this individual's father, who apparently did not know that this individual was pregnant. Another example, the ability to identify when there are these high peak emotional moments in gameplay and to deliver that advertising when those individuals are most receptive to the brand message. Wonderful opportunity here. As it turns out, Microsoft has actually filed a patent on this. I don't know whether this has actually been approved or not. And again, in these situations, I'm not saying good, bad. I'm simply saying these are examples of where things are going with our ability to collect this data, and it raises these questions and why we need to keep our eyes wide open. So how do we keep our eyes wide open? Well, there is an existing framework. Our values, standards of business conduct, laws, policy, the MPS. So we have the corporate values, a set of beliefs that help govern our behavior. Integrity, honesty, open, respectful. I think you guys are all familiar with these. We also have the standards of business conduct, and those reflect our commitment to ethical business practices. And all of us need to know those values, the standards of business conduct, the laws, regulations, and the policies that apply. So for a lot of us here, that's the Microsoft privacy policy, and then the standards that go along with that. So that's great. That's very, very helpful. The standards are very, very helpful in a lot of situations. The policies are very helpful in a lot of situations. But in those scenarios that we just went through, how do we begin to draw the lines around what's really acceptable? A lot of times, those laws aren't there already. Those standards aren't there already. Right now, we can ask, we do ask, is it consistent with our business values? Does it meet the business objectives? Is it legal? Is it permitted under the notice and consent? We've heard a lot about notice and consent, what that makes happen or doesn't make happen. And then is it compliant with our standards? As I said, even if you're following the law, you can do some stuff that makes your stomach a little bit uncomfortable. And that's a quote from the Target employee who was the data analyst in that case. So what we end up doing is saying, well, okay, yeah, it does all these things, but is it creepy? Which just then brings us back to the values, the high-level corporate values again. And really understanding, well, what is creepy? I think we all know, we all have a slightly different variation on terms of where is that creepy line? What does that mean? What does it mean across different cultures? So we need to ask, what is the ethical thing to do? And really, what is creepy? And I'd say there's creepy plus. There's the choices we make about who gets to participate. So in terms of what offers we enable, in terms of on what devices are different services available to, and who actually can afford or use those different devices. We are making all kinds of decisions about who can participate. We're also making decisions about users and how they're defining were expressing their identity. In this case, Mark Zuckerberg saying, if you have more than one identity, then you lack integrity. Well, as we heard earlier, is his identity the same when he talks about his business as he is in terms of protecting his information? We're also making decisions about who gets what. In this case, Orbitz had done some analysis and determined that Mac users actually were willing to spend more and frequently did spend more on certain travel. Turns out they were buying the top level rooms versus the medium level rooms, and they were willing to pay more, so they charged them more. We're also making decisions about what users will do, what they will become in the future. In this case, the Target is a great example. When you think about education or any sort of other opportunities that come from big data. We're also making decisions about what opportunities users have to alter the decisions that are being made. Kate Crawford, who's an MSR researcher, very interesting paper on really big data and due process. What sort of rights and opportunities do individuals have to change the decisions that are being made, the offers that are being made, the things that are being said about them that are then changing a lot of their experiences? So we need to establish a common vocabulary and mechanisms to identify and address these issues. So I know I'm running out of time, but there's a couple of potential paths forward I can present here. And this afternoon we'll have an opportunity to dig into these further. So we can map our values, policies, and standards against different scenarios. So we've got our values, we've got our policy, we know some different scenarios that may not be covered in the standards, and we can begin to say, well, do we have some gaps here? In that case, again, for discussion purposes only, in some cases, maybe we could say we need to do a better job of requiring teams to identify what is the benefit that's being offered here. Benefit as a key component of what regulators are thinking about in terms of the sufficiency of the notice and the consent. We can also talk about, we talked about contextual integrity. In terms of respect, are we respecting the context in which the user gave us that data? In terms of the perspective, are there situations where we actually need to more formally say we need to require a different perspective on these types of data uses? And control. Are we really providing enough control to those users about all these different potential uses and implications for their lives? Or maybe we could just add to our current policy. We've got the policy that's largely aligned with FIPS. And maybe we just need to add something that says it's aligned with data ethics. Say we take steps to ensure that our collection, use of the data is in keeping with our values and foster. And then from there, we can develop a whole set of standards that go along with that. We can also establish new mechanisms. I think this will be great because Janice is going to talk about this one and a couple others in particular. Maybe we need a cross-functional review group who can really dig into these and provide more input, more guidance, and a different perspective. Maybe there's an opportunity to identify different questions that we could ask at the right stages in the data lifecycle that are really going to drive people to ask these right questions and come up with some different solutions. I don't want to get into this, but it covers a lot more information. But if we looked at those different points in the life cycle, there's all sorts of opportunities to ask, do we really want to collect this data? Do we need to collect this data? The implications of collecting this data, or even telling users that we're going to collect this data, may have a chilling effect or may have other implications that we really aren't comfortable with, or our users aren't going to be comfortable with. In terms of our expression of rules, when we're tagging the data, the decisions and how we express those rules and what we mean in the words that we have also have implications that we need to be aware of. In terms of how long do we store the data and who has access to that data. And there's a whole other set of questions around the modeling of that data and Maybe we just want to create some inferences around sexual orientation, or we want to create inferences around any number of different things. We should be asking certain questions at those different points. And we've gone through, and there's all sorts of different questions. We can dig into these this afternoon. There's time. And it's really about trying to prompt teams and individuals to expand their thinking about the potential harms, potential benefits of their use of the data. In this case, what we did was try and map some questions to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and some analysis that Ryan Kalo, who's now at the UW, did around objective and subjective harms that could impact individuals. And again, as I mentioned, maybe we need some new standards that require analysis of benefits, that require contextual integrity, that require analysis of the harm. So, next steps. We've got a working group session. Your input, incredibly valuable, really appreciated. And then what I'll do is, for those who are interested, set up a follow-up session. Because where we want to go right now is identifying those scenarios, identifying potential gates, and testing of prompting of questions or other sorts of analysis that we can do with a specific team in different scenarios. Because what we don't want to do is drive, ethics applies really to everything that we do. We're not in a situation right now to drive the ethical framework for all of Microsoft. What we want to do is drive value to those teams who are trying to make right decisions right now and get the services and products shipped. And then moving forward, before you know it, we'll be able to address ethics in our algorithms. It's a little bit of a joke, I mean, but there's the opportunity there. But it's not today. Today, we have to take these initial steps. With that, what I want to do is introduce Janice, because Janice is actually working on these initial steps within MSR.
Hi, I'm Janice Tsai. I am the privacy manager for Microsoft Research. And this is going to be more kind of like an overview of how ethics works, at least in a research setting. So in terms of Microsoft Research, we really believe in doing innovative and cutting-edge research. And I really believe that we're enabled to do that with this outer ring of making sure that we are doing things in an ethical manner as well as in a privacy protective manner. And so the reason why this is a big deal in research is because not so long ago, researchers used to do really, really horrible things. In the 1930s, there's this thing called the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, where we basically wanted to study, or the government wanted to study, how untreated syphilis would affect rural African American men. So they found 600 people, the majority of whom had syphilis, and they just said, hey, we're going to provide you with free health care. Hooray! They did not tell them that they were sick. They just said that, oh, I think you have bad blood. Unfortunately, this study spanned 40 years, and 10 years after the inception of the study, they'd pretty much figured out how to cure syphilis. But they prevented people from actually getting treatment or ever even finding out that they had this disease. And so, of course, that led to many bad things. Similarly, in a university setting at Yale, there's this famous experiment called the Milgram Obedience Experiment. Milgram wanted to see how people dealt with people in positions of authority and whether they would just agree to do whatever someone who was in authority would tell them to do. And so they solicited participants. They solicited participants. And so people would show up in a room. They'd be like, oh, I'm here for a study. Draw a straw. Oh, I'm going to be the teacher. You'll be the learner. So the teacher is on, this is the left, and then the learner. And all the learners, unbeknownst to the people who were selected as teachers, this is played by an actor. And so in the getting to know you phase or in the waiting phase, they'd be like, the actor would say, oh, I'm feeling kind of funny. I have this heart condition. I've been sick. What's going on? And they would say, hey, we're going to have you answer questions every time the learner gets something incorrect. Push this button to shock them. So there's this machine that was supposed to be delivering electrical shocks, and they just move it a tick every time the person got something wrong. And so it's clearly marked on the machine that there's a danger sign, as well as an XXX death, horrible, do not do this sign. And during the session, the learner would start screaming and pounding on the walls and then just become unresponsive. And the participant would be like, oh, I'm not really comfortable, I kind of want to stop. But there'd be a person in the white lab coat saying, no, please continue. And they would keep on telling them to continue up to 3 times. And for the majority of the participants, they just kept on going. At the end of the study, they just said, thanks for coming, see you later, here's your, here's your gift certificate, or here's some candy, bye. And this caused significant psychological harm to the people who participated, because they really thought, they never realized that the person wasn't being shocked and that they didn't actually just kill someone, right? So this was one of these things that was really bad. And this spurred a change in laws and the creation of what's called institutional review boards. So now institutional review boards are required anytime there's research that's been funded by federal departments or agencies. And there's a whole set of regulations and rules that's outlined by the Department of Health and Human Services. One of the other things that came out of this time period were reports kind of talking about basic principles. So the most well-known report is the Belmont Report, coming out in 1979. And so these are kind of like the basic things that you should think about in terms of ethics. You have to respect people, make sure you're protecting their autonomy, that you obtain informed consent, and that you're truthful about what's going on as much as possible. That you figure out the beneficence in terms of do no harm to people and weigh the risks and benefits. And finally, at the end, making sure that procedures are administered fairly. So at MSR, we do have an ethics program, and our focus is really to have people consider the ethics in their research. And we have an ethics advisory board to discuss those thorny issues and questions, and it's made up of researchers from all the labs around the world that we have. And people can go through several options for an ethics review. They can either use their collaborator's university or medical ethics review board. They can hire an external one, or they can go through our process. And for us, in terms of a computer science type of world, these are the kind of high-level best practices I try to convey to our researchers. If they're dealing with people, like having people come in or even online, they have to obtain informed consent. And if they are planning on using deception, because in some cases you do have to deceive people so that they don't act differently than what they would normally do, that you should debrief them afterwards about the true cause. An example of this is if you're trying to study how people look at error messages, you can't tell them, hey, we're studying error messages, because then they're going to pay really careful attention to those error messages. And in terms of privacy, I really want to make sure people are aware of the source of their data, that they've notified people properly in terms of data collection and use, that they're storing and sharing that data correctly, and they're protecting it as much as they can. And I'm just going to jump to one final scenario, because I think this is the really interesting one in terms of Twitter. So we have this issue where there's a lot of data that's available online, and the terms and services of these online websites, like Twitter or other social networks, not including Facebook, they just say, hey, you are aware that you're posting your information online. We're not liable for what happens afterwards, right? If other people see what books you like to read, or if other people see the locations you're going to, it's up to you to really protect your own privacy, right? And so that means researchers from all over the world are just going out and scraping data and creating these large data sets. And here's one such example of research that is interesting and can be done. In this case, it's related to Twitter communities. There's researchers in our Silicon Valley lab. They wanted to analyze the Twitter fire hose or all the different tweets that were coming out. And they found that they could algorithmically identify groups loosely organized around hashtags. So in case you've never seen Twitter, people often add little number signs or a hashtag to help other people search for tweets. In this case, oftentimes if you go to an event or a conference or everyone's going to see the same movie, you use a hashtag so you can self-identify, like, oh, I really liked Hunger Games, or, oh, I'm at the Privacy Law Scholars Conference, PLSC. And so they found that in addition to these one-time only based on event hashtag things happening, there's people that have actually used hashtags to organize like weekly communities or weekly discussion groups. And in their presentation of the research, one of the Bing teams saw that they had done this and said, oh, wouldn't it be great if when people were doing searches in Bing, that they could also see a Twitter group that would be associated with their search term. In this example, someone has searched for dementia, and there is an Alzheimer's support group that meets on Mondays at 6 p.m. To 8 p.m. And we can figure out how to identify and scrape these chats, and then figure out what the main topics were, and then maybe categorize them and allow people to see archives. Right? So that means, oh, now we can help people find these people to talk to in case they want support for Alzheimer's. And so this is one example of what, this is just a mock-up of what that would look like. Right? And so I think the difficult thing is that in terms of legality, this would be fine to do, right? Because there's nothing, if you were using the public Twitter APIs and you were collecting tweets and doing all this investigation and analysis on your own, you could say, hey, there's a travel group that meets on Wednesdays, there's another support group that meets on Thursdays, let's surface these groups. Unfortunately, people don't really have a good understanding about the, as we've mentioned before, context is very important. So if I'm part of an Alzheimer's support group, I'm thinking I'm just chatting with these people about my problems and all these feelings I have and how I'm so upset about my grandfather having Alzheimer's. I don't necessarily expect that a search engine is just going to make this public for everyone to see. And as the moderator of such a group, maybe I don't even want other people to be able to see this who aren't part of the community. And so one of the analogies that we like to use is you could be like an AA group that meets regularly. You go and you get together, you go to the park, it's a nice sunny day, you sit under a tree. You expect the conversation you have is private, even though you are in a public space. You don't expect that anyone else is typing everything you're saying and putting it somewhere for people to see forever. And so what happens with Twitter is like it's become like a microphone is in the tree, actually doing that recording and broadcasting to the world. Right? So we're still trying to figure out what is the best way to deal with these ethical issues. Because on one hand, there's legal, but on the other hand, there's ethical. And unfortunately, in terms of ethics, there's not really like a hard line rule, just like in privacy. Right? In privacy, we talk about that creepy feeling. Same thing in ethics. Like, we could do this, but should we? And the other issue is related, again, as we've mentioned, big data, where before, especially in computer science, maybe we were studying error logs related to the system, not people. But now people are the data, and that shift of doing that understanding of, oh, I'm studying Twitter data, Facebook data, other Foursquare social networking location data, it's getting that mind shift to or having people still understand this is about actual people still. It's not just anonymous data. So these are some of the issues that we're grappling with. We're going to be creating kind of a more concrete review system, as well as a submission process with peer reviewers. And I'd be happy to hear about the needs from other product groups, and maybe we can have a Microsoft-wide system instead of just a research-specific system or just a, other types of platform-specific systems. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Janice.